Now, excellent. I'd like to thank everybody for coming by. This is the first in a new season of Inside the Avatar Studio, and we have today as our special guest John Lester, who most people probably remember quite fondly as Pathfinder Linden. So just to give a bit of an introduction here, John's worked at Linden Lab from 2005 to 2010, where he acted as general strategist and product expert to help customers using Second Life for teaching, academic, and healthcare research. He was also involved with medical education, simulation, and scientific visualization. He's also served as, I'm going to butcher the word, and I apologize for this, lead evangelist in market development, broadly exploring and cultivating innovation in the intersection of emerging markets and Second Life, such as education, healthcare, enterprise, government, and entertainment. And John, Pathfinder, welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio.
Great, thanks for having me.
Oh, but most welcome. I mean, I'm not sure if a lot of people realize, but we were actually quite fortunate that you've actually come on board with us here at Rockcliffe as one of our board of director members, as one of the advisory board. Mm-hmm. Part of the lecture that you were giving at the SLCC, you actually mentioned that you're on the advisory board for a number of other organizations as well, not just Rockcliffe. Did you want to give a little bit of an idea in terms of which other organizations that you've been associated with, and to a certain extent, why those particular organizations?
Sure.
What's the sort of common thread that's running between them?
No, that's a very good question. So first of all, I'm still in Second Life, as you can see, except my avatar's name has changed. And I apologize if my voice is a little scratchy, but I've been sick the past week. My voice hasn't fully come back yet. So there are a number of very innovative things. Many innovative things still going on in Second Life that I'm still interested in after having left Linden Lab. And my basic underlying theme is still around using virtual worlds for teaching and learning, and also looking at how different types of markets and communities intersect in this environment and how they can develop through those intersections. And by that I mean things like where education intersects with the arts in Second Life. You have a lot of artists in Second Life creating very engaging experiences, and that's a primary goal for educators, is to engage their students, to get them excited and connected with content and learning experiences in Second Life. So a couple other things. I'm also involved with the Frank Lloyd Wright Museum in Second Life. They're actually an official. They're working officially with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and are doing a lot of really interesting things in terms of creating compelling content. And I think there's a lot of potential, particularly for creating immersive stories that you can use for entertainment, for education, for artistic purposes, you could really imagine. And I'm actually also involved in a few things in the outside of Second Life. I can't talk about all of them. Some of them very early stage startups. But really, the fundamental thing that I'm interested in is really strategic planning around how to use technology to facilitate community growth and cultural growth. And I really think of that in the broadest terms. So while I'm very interested, continuing to be very interested in virtual worlds, I'm also very interested in the entire constellation of tools that are available to us today as we're communicating. Things like Twitter, things like Facebook. I'm very interested in the explosion of casual gaming. The casual gaming space is huge. Millions and millions of people are spending little brief moments in these games that are in an underlying way, are actually very social. So if you've played any of these casual games, the ones that really take off are the ones that allow you to play with your friends. It's not playing a casual game of solitaire on your computer. It's a game that involves you helping other friends during their gameplay as well. So I'm very broadly interested in all these technologies and where they all come together and what the new possibilities are. And really, at the bottom of it all is I'm really interested in looking for new ways to tell stories. Using these different technologies, using virtual worlds, using things like casual games, using these different communication modalities that are connecting people and are connecting cultures. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
It's not exactly a small nutshell, though. I mean, it's a fairly.
I'm full of nuts. I'm nutty. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because and you and we've talked about this, different aspects of this over the last several months. But I mean, things like what the Frank Lloyd Wright Center are doing, and I think one of the other groups you were talking about was the Oddfellow Studios, and how
that's another group.
How they're combining art and neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's to a certain extent. I mean, that's a fairly fascinating combination of things that they're sort of working on. So when you're looking at the integration of the physical and the virtual, and we're looking at new ways to tell stories, how do you see something like what they're working on sort of leading us into, I guess, sort of next steps or changes in paradigm or what we see sort of coming up in the future?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So with Oddfellow Studios, they create amazing art, but they also are looking very deeply into how to do things. For instance, induce certain types of mental states that are very conducive for, say, pain relief or relaxation. This isn't New Age stuff. This is actual grounded in real science. There's actually just Google the relaxation response. There's actually a large body of literature out there that shows that you can actually induce quantifiable physiological changes in the human body based on entering what you would describe non-scientifically as different sort of meditative states. And so really this is actually another key thing about what I'm interested in and where I think the future of all this is going. I'm really not people seem to think I'm like a real kind of gung-ho transhumanist kind of person. Like we're going to be uploaded in these machines and the machines will combine with us and the machines will make us better. I'm really not. I'm not quite sure how people got that idea. What I'm all about is augmenting and recognizing what makes us human. So, for instance, one thing that makes us very human is our desire to communicate with each other. So, if you improve the ability to communicate, if you improve the emotional bandwidth of those tools so that you can convey very subtle things. Think of all the data that's involved in the complexity of our body language and our facial expressions. When we communicate, if we can increase emotional bandwidth in interesting ways, in creative ways, then we augment what makes us human. So we're basically, we're not becoming more than human, we're becoming more human and better connected. And that's actually it's kind of a running theme. I have a blog that I've been posting a bunch of my thoughts about this. It's I'll type it in chat here. It's be cunning and full of tricks.com. There we go. Let's see here. There we go. So one of my sort of personal heroes of all time was Doug Engelbart, who was an engineer is an engineer, and he did things like invented the mouse, and he constantly talked about this concept of augmenting the human mind. And so that's something that I'm very interested in. Oh, emotional bandwidth. Okay, for instance, let's see. An example, text. Text has a limited amount of emotional bandwidth to do things like convey real-time facial expressions. So, for instance, I'm looking back in the public chat here, and I see, Lawn Runner used an emoticon. Why do we use emoticons? We use emoticons because you can't see the person's face as they're typing a sentence. But they're primitive, exactly. So you're kind of like, it's a hack. Emoticons are hacks. The same way in Second Life, you have no way, even though you have avatars. And in fact, this is kind of, unfortunately, this gets us into trouble sometimes, because I can look out into the audience and I may see an avatar that's slumped over, AFK, and they may be listening to me more intently than anyone else in the audience. But I don't have. There's not emotional bandwidth to see that. The maximum amount of emotional bandwidth would be face-to-face interactions, where you can see things like body language. You can see people making and breaking eye contact, which is actually a very critical part of communicating face-to-face. And so, for instance, the other thing in terms of emotional bandwidth, when somebody types a sentence, you can't hear if they are tired or hear if they're kind of frustrated. But if you use voice, you can pick up a lot of subtle emotional subtext. So that's really what I mean by emotional bandwidth.
Yeah, I know one of the things that we have constant problems with, and I mean, it's not limited to Second Life. It extends into the working environment on a regular basis, is this whole concept where email does not really convey what it is that you're necessarily trying to say. I mean, you can use all the right words, but the subtext of what it is you're trying to convey gets completely skewed based upon whether or not somebody's had their coffee that morning or not. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it does become fairly interesting in that regard. You had also talked about at the SLCC, you were talking about game design in a group called Logos.
Oh yeah, I'm not involved with them officially in any way, but they are they've created a really awesome combat card game that is a game that you play against an opponent one-on-one, but it's also participatory. You can have people in the audience seeing the card game as it's going on, and you have these really neat animations and special effects and things like that happening. So things like game design. I'm just very, very interested in how to create experiences that engage people, and how to leverage things like virtual worlds to make it a richer environment. So, for instance, Logos could have easily been designed as a web game or a Facebook game, very easily, because it's playing cards. But the neat thing with the virtual environment is you have the ability to create these more perceptually immersive experiences, and they have things like Logos arenas where people come and watch people fight using the cards, and it's got the same sort of theme as the cards. It's just really fun. It's very immersive. But for instance, I think what the Logos folks should do, this is just my own personal opinion, but I think they should develop a Facebook app. I think they should develop also something that can just run standalone on the web. I think they should also develop an iPhone app. I mean, that would be the smartest thing to do if you're looking for the broadest audience. Of course, the challenge there is development resources. You only have so much you can spend. Just Google Logos card game Second Life, and you can find it.
Yeah, as you're talking about the expansion of this into other virtual arenas. I mean, it does sort of get into this idea that and certainly most people here have experienced the trials and tribulations that have been going on within Second Life, and certainly yourself and a lot of other people from the lab have been living a lot of this stuff for years and years. There seems to be, at this particular point, there seems to be a lot of interesting tools that are sort of coming up on the horizon. So, for example, Unity 3D as being a platform where people can develop a game simulation and take it into Xbox or Wii or onto the Apple iPhone. Some of these new technologies that are coming out. I mean, there's Blue Mars. There's a whole lot of others, and some of them are fairly good, and some of them are not so good. How do you sort of see the next couple of years sort of playing out in terms of how these technologies are sort of being positioned?
Well, that's a good question. And actually, I saw some questions in open chat about more about the sort of real-time transference of facial expressions and so forth. And I'd happy to be talk about that afterwards too. And I wrote a long piece on my blog about that. But to speak to your question, there are a lot of really interesting tools, and the trick is being able to do things now, while at the same time being ready for things in the future that you're not 100% sure about. Right? That's I talk a lot about hope. How, when things are confusing and hard and there are weird things going on, and there's, the economy is tanking in the United States and all this crazy stuff. It's important to have hope, but I define hope as optimism plus critical planning, which means you have to have a plan. It's not enough to just be optimistic. You have to have serious critical planning. And part of that really applies to what's going on in virtual worlds and with Second Life and the future of virtual worlds. There's a lot of stuff right now. There are a lot of interesting different platforms. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with OpenSim. There's a lot of power with Unity 3D. It brings a lot to the table. The people who are using virtual worlds now need to really explore all of these different possibilities in the future, but not let that option paralysis prevent you from focusing on what's around you right now. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out as be optimistic, but make sure you have critical planning. And part of that really means you have to explore these other platforms. I tell a lot of educators, I tell educators, if you're not looking at OpenSim right now, you're crazy. You really need to be looking at this as a platform. Because it gives you a level of flexibility and cost effectiveness that no other platform offers right now. I tell them, you need to spend some time really looking at the different tools coming down the pipe. At the same time, there's, you can think about what practically could come, but I like to kind of think a bit further than that too sometimes, to think about where this is all ultimately heading. And it was funny, and it was perfectly illustrated by I rented the movie Repo Man. I don't know if you folks have seen it. Not the 1980s Repo Man, but the modern one, Repo Man, where they repossess people's organs. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie. It's actually kind of like a Minority Report movie, but there's a wonderful scene in that movie where he's talking to his kid, and he goes into his kid's bedroom, and the walls of his bedroom are blue, and all of a sudden you hear this sound, and you see a fish swim by on the walls, and you suddenly realize that all of the paint, and it's not just flat. His room actually has his child's room has a not just floor flat walls, but kind of interesting architecture. And basically the paint on the walls is a monitor. And as the kid is sleeping in his room, his whole room becomes a giant fish tank, and these fish are just sort of circling around, and there's a shark, and it looks completely real. To me, that is really the end game for virtual worlds. It's when you have the ability to create environments where the virtual and the physical completely overlap, where you're not thinking about, I'm looking at a monitor. If every surface is painted as a monitor, then that means wherever you look can be a monitor. Wherever you look can be a window. In fact, one wall of a room could actually be, it could give you the appearance of being just a window into the other half of a room. So, Cisco telepresence, exactly, James, right? Except, I'm thinking even beyond that, where the technology, if you told somebody 20 years ago, it's like, oh yeah, you're going to be carrying around these little things called iPhones, and they're going to be able to do all of this stuff, and they're going to have a monitor that, where it doesn't need to be any higher resolution because it's at the limit of your human ability to see. They'd say you're crazy. So, I think, thinking about 20 years where you have the technology to essentially paint monitors and everything. And I think ultimately the future of where all of this stuff is going is where it will be seamlessly integrated with the architecture around us in the world.
So let me throw out something that's going to a little bit off the wall. Not that I have a habit of doing these types of things, right? But to a certain extent, we've gotten to this point with where the web and where access to a lot of this information is, where we're pulling information from, is becoming commercialized way beyond anything that we've ever seen in the past. Mm-hmm. So you look at Google, or you look at websites that are essentially paid for by Google Ads. You look at what the History Channel is doing, where they're now introducing ads into the middle of, you've always had that commercial break in between segments of a program. Well, the History Channel is now introducing advertisements over top of content that you're watching. So not only do you get your commercial breaks, but you get the commercials during the program itself. We talk about this aspect of the end game, where this is all going. But I think there's a subtext in here in terms of where, to a certain extent, how it's all going to be paid for. And when you have that bubble, you go to sleep, and you go to sleep inside an aquarium, basically. How are we essentially going to prevent corporate and other entities from sort of invading that space on us, right? As we want to get access to higher end content, because a lot of the stuff that we're working with, and I understand that we're sort of using a bit of a brute force approach right at the moment, but a lot of stuff really, it takes a lot of time and effort for people to create, especially in a virtualized environment. This is not simple stuff that we're doing, although it appears that way. So I don't know, have you given any thought to where the commercialized aspect is going to maybe, either increase in presence or, hopefully decrease in presence?
Well, there's a challenge of, there are two things. You can focus on the corporate control of the tools and pipes, right? But you can also think about the corporate control of the cultural content, and the latter actually worries me more, concerns me more. When you think of culture, when you think of the stories, the music, the way culture advances, if you think about the cultural content of our species, right now I'd say it's mostly commercially owned, copyrighted, trademarked. There is a huge amount of commercialization in the culture around us. I challenge folks to talk about some interesting cultural aspect that doesn't involve some corporate ownership of the content. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it is stifling. It doesn't necessarily mean it's evil, but it could be. If for instance, you see a lot of remixing going on. There's a huge remix culture happening where people are taking video and text and stories and mashing them up and so forth. And you see some companies being more amenable to that than others. You see some people saying, "No, we're not going to allow you to do that," and some companies allowing you to do that. So, I think personally, that's something to keep an eye on. Is making sure that the the cultural content that is being provided by companies is provided in a way that is such that the companies can survive and make money, but not at the expense of people. Chantal mentions copyrights. The laws need to change. Copyrights are supposed to help innovation, not protect revenue streams of corporations. Patents are supposed to allow innovators to succeed, not allow people to stifle the competition by suing over patent disputes, right? So there's a lot of, I'm more interested on that sort of side of things, which really gets down to intellectual property issues, gets down to all that whole, we could have a whole conference talking about IP issues in the brave new world of the future here. But it is scary when some of these tools are, all around us. I heard a quote from someone at Google saying, I think people want Google to not tell them where things are, but people want Google to tell them what to do next. And he was totally serious. That was the CEO, Schmidt. It's like, I think you should go to this movie. People want to be told what to do next. That's chilling.
That is kind of scary, but I guess to a large extent, it's also one of a coping mechanism to deal with information overload. Right? When you get so much information that you just, as you were talking about before, this idea of paralysis when looking at other virtual worlds, right? There's so many of them that are out there.
Yeah. But we have to learn to focus. At the end of the day, you have to sit back and go, am I happier and a better person because of all this technology? I constantly think about it from the human perspective. Is technology and the affordances of the technology improving your quality of life? Period. That's the only question that really matters. If you are feeling completely overwhelmed, you should, because of your BlackBerry, you should probably get rid of the BlackBerry. But the trick is to identify the things that improve your life. So, for instance, Math Bear in the audience is saying my life is far richer because of the net and Second Life, and that's great. That's awesome. And I think these tools have the ability, the technology in general has the ability to open up creative potential, as well as connecting us with other people in ways we could never hope for. Right? It's not about, it's not about amusing ourselves to death. It's about making our lives more meaningful, richer. But you have to, Mal Burns says in the audience, isolating the tools from the propaganda. You have to do that.
Yeah, it was interesting. We just recently launched here at Rockcliffe a series of classes on health and fitness. The idea being trying to figure out how we can extend what we're doing in the virtual into the real world, and to a certain extent encourage lifestyle changes in the way people are approaching health and fitness. And as we've met on a number of SLCC events over the last couple of years, and certainly I'm no sprite person like my avatar is. But one of the things that we've been finding is this aspect to what it is we're doing in here. You look at platforms like the Wii, which have Wii Fit, Wii Sports, Wii, these games that are meant to be interactive, and almost to a single one, they're all meant to be played almost one-on-one between you and your computer in the living room, which takes out that whole aspect that you were talking about earlier in terms of social development, right? Is how we work with social bandwidth and how we use it in order to influence change, right? And so we've had a few people say, hey, why don't you use the Wii for this? Because, they've got all these great tools. Well, they do, but none of them work across the internet, right? So, I mean, we've still got a long way to go in terms of our understanding, I think, in terms, how, where a lot of this stuff is eventually going to lead us into. And there's so much that we can, as you were talking about back in August, I mean, this concept of being pioneers, and that this time frame that we're in right now is a really unique point in history that will never, to a large extent, will never come again. Right? There are opportunities opening up right at the moment. And to that end, you were also talking a lot about this idea of predicting the future. Right? And we've talked a little bit about predicting the future. What do you see sort of going into that? I mean, because to predict the future implies, people have some type of a model, whether it's an intuitive or whether it's an adaptive or whether it's based on some type of scientific fact or research. I mean, how are you sort of defining your model as to how we predict the future?
Well, there are a couple ways to do that. The one way is to invent it. That's an easy way to predict it. And a few folks have. The invention of the web. Tim Berners-Lee kind of nailed it. Doug Engelbart nailed it with the invention of the mouse. Hold on a second. Oh, sorry. But that's really hard. You can't invent everything in the future. Most of the time, the future just kind of comes out of left field and smacks us in the head. And you can use all kinds of clever sounding sayings, like Wayne Gretzky saying, the trick is not to skate where the puck is, it's to skate to where the puck will be. It's like that doesn't tell you anything about how to get there. I think the way to really get there is has to do with how you respond to change. And I don't mean being adaptive to change. I actually don't like that term when people say we have to be very adaptive to change, because that also doesn't really tell you really what you should be doing. What does that mean? Adapt to change. What does that mean? I have to bend like a reed in the wind? What the hell does that mean? The phrase that I find most useful is purely just being very, very attentive to everything around you. It's about attentiveness. It's about really paying attention to how things are, not how you want them to be or wish them to be, right? Because we spend a lot of time projecting our wishes on reality. We spend a lot of time wishing. And sometimes I think that can get us into into trouble, where we start to see things on an unconscious level in ways that aren't reflective of what reality is all about. Plus, we have the tendency to overload ourselves with all kinds of stimuli. We get overloaded. We have very little opportunity to focus on things. So, I tell people, if you want to really think about, really sort of pay attention to what's going on right now, what's going on in the future. Do things like, disconnect yourself from the Walkman for a little while, turn off your cell phone for a little while. There is no such thing as multitasking. That's actually totally a myth. Your human brain cannot multitask. What it can do is task switch. It can switch between different higher cognitive tasks. Yes, it can multitask on the limbic system level, where you can be walking and digesting your food at the same time. But you can't be thinking of two different things at the same time, period. But you can switch between them. And guess what? Our brains are really bad at doing that. Our brains are really bad at task switching. So I think it really kind of comes down to attentiveness in terms of being ready for the future, really paying attention, observing how things are. If you're a business person, really looking very closely at your market and what your customers are doing, with as little projection of your wishes onto that as possible, and that'll give you the clearest picture.
Okay, but yet when we start talking about pioneering strategies, and again, I'm referring back to your talk here in August. There has to be some type of guiding principles involved with trying to not just predict the future, but also to make the future. I mean, as much as I'm trying to figure out how to put this properly. One of the things that we do here at Rockcliffe is, although we have all these various different things that we could be doing, and there's a lot of things, and sometimes we do go down the wrong paths every once in a while. But eventually we come back and we say, well, wait a second, hold on, that's that was important, but it's not as important as doing these core things. So let's sort of bring things back and refocus and get back onto where the vision is sort of trying to take us to. But somewhere along the line, you have to have some type of balance between being attentive to what is out there and having the vision and the I guess sort of courage to go where other people are not going. In terms of a strategy, and in terms of being those pioneers. So I mean, and we've got a number of pioneers here with us actually today. I mean, all kinds of people that are taking those steps to say, this is important, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm good at.
Yeah, I agree.
Speaking of task switching,
I think it's my dryer. It's weird. Yeah. Just letting you know the clothes are done.
So how do you reconcile that between this idea of being observant of your surroundings and yet maintaining a strategic focus?
Actually, no, Nigma, I'm not in my basement. My dryer is upstairs next to the bathroom. So it's in a closet. That's why. I don't see a conflict between those two. I mean, being attentive, being focused. Part of being attentive is being focused on the right things. It's on not being distracted. Part of really being attentive to what's happening around you means picking the right things to focus on. I think that's. I see those two things as complementary, and that's a real challenge. It's a real challenge these days, just because we have a. It's funny, I talk a lot about, focusing on. I mean, my background is in neurology and neuroscience, and I think a lot about what makes us human. What are the fundamental things about our minds that are special and human, and a lot of what makes us human we forget about because we're too close to it. It's like asking a fish, how does it feel to be wet? It's like, and so, some of the things that, unfortunately, some of the things that make us most human are also things that'll get us into trouble, right? I actually blogged about this one thing recently, the whole idea of pattern recognition. Pattern recognition gets us into real trouble when we are looking not just at things in the physical world, but when we're looking at things that are abstract concepts. And an example of that, if you're thinking about being a pioneer, when pioneers are presented with new tools to help them, do whatever they're going to do, the first thing that the human mind will do when it's presented with something novel is it'll look at it and go, okay, what does that remind me of? What does that remind me of? And then whatever it reminds you of, your brain will treat it as that. So the example I gave, I blogged about this too. When the motion picture camera first came out, people noticed that the projected image on the wall looked a lot like a stage. So people thought, okay, we'll film plays. And so they would take a motion picture camera, stick it on a pole in front of a stage, and film a play. And it took decades before people realized, you know what, motion pictures aren't plays. You could actually film from multiple cameras at the same time, cut between them, do this thing called post-production. And you see this time and time again with technologies. And so, for instance, the web, when it first came out, if those of you who remember in the 90s, it was all about scanning your brochures, really. Companies everywhere thought that the web was just basically a way to distribute brochures. The whole concept of Web 2.0 stuff, of things like interactive websites, things like Flickr. Some still do Abacus, that's true, but that stuff had to take time because our brains were over focused on pattern matching. Okay, it's on the screen, it's got pictures and text, it kind of looks like desktop publishing. Okay, that's what the web is all about. It's desktop publishing. So part of that, so it all comes back to this attentiveness coupled with innovation. So, if you're very attentive to the tools that are at your disposal, for instance, with virtual worlds, if you're very attentive to the tools that are in Second Life, to the tools that are being presented by these other platforms, you won't start treating them just like anything else, that's something you already know. You'll treat them as something truly innovative and do things that no one else has done before, and that's how you innovate. So I think that's part of recognizing part of leveraging what makes us most human is realizing that everything that makes us most human is not everything is great. There are some parts of us that are kind of like, well, we kind of overfire on the pattern recognition stuff. Well, we kind of get distracted. We like novel stimulus. Our brains are wired to really dig like lots of data coming in. So that's why people love, getting tons of, well, that's weird. That's why people love getting tons of IMs and connecting with, over-connecting, spreading their attention too thin. So it's a razor's edge you have to walk.
Cool. The extension of this idea of predicting strategy, attentiveness, and its transition into tactics. Because I know that's something else that you're very strong on in terms of there's this idea of strategy and then there's tactics, and the two are not the same thing, nor should they be, right?
No, but people sometimes confuse them. Yeah.
Well, even the best of us get it wrong from time to time. I guess to a large extent, where are you seeing the tactical side of all of this sort of going? Because that's really where it's getting down to the brass, no pun intended, but the brass tacks in terms of really making things happen. You can strategize until you're blue in the face, but until you've actually done something, right? Yeah. It's really it's noise is really all it is.
Yeah. Well, that's on strategy and tactics. So simple way to think of strategy and tactics is if you think of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, that's a quote that I always like. Is strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, while tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And in a nutshell, speaking at it from a sort of military analogy, tactics are, okay, we're gonna take this hill by sending these troops up the left, and we're gonna send these other guys up the right. Strategy is, do we need to occupy this hill to win the war, or should we be doing something completely different? All right. So tactics is all about the doing, about the executing, while the strategy is the broader thinking through of what your goals are broadly. So in terms of, I think there's a lot of tactical stuff that still needs to be done to really get virtual worlds to a point where we can really start exploring their potential. It's still way too unfinished. It's for me at least. It's I think of I like to talk a lot about the idea of linking real life facial expressions and body language to avatars as something that's optional, right? People are, whenever I say that, people sometimes worry like, well, I don't want everyone to see me if my avatar's yawning. But the point is, we don't even have that option. right now. We don't have any option like that. So I think with computers, like Math Bear is saying in the audience, look how long it took to realize the potential of computers. I feel like we're trying to talk about the potential of a global networked environment back when all we had was, text interfaces to the internet. Before graphical user interfaces almost. So that's kind of where virtual worlds seem to me right now. The idea is there. The idea of a shared space, the idea of your representation as an avatar, the idea of a malleable environment is there. What we don't have is the ability to move flexibly between different worlds. We don't have the ability to really immerse yourself in the environment in a way that automatically can connect a lot of these higher emotional bandwidth communication modalities and things like that. I think that we're getting there, and the trick is to realize that, and this is part of strategy, where it dovetails with tactics, is you want to get somewhere, but that means you have to execute really well on all the steps between where you are now and where you want to go. I think that's critical, and I think that there's going to be really interesting. I think the next 5 years, just from a tactical perspective, to see how all these different virtual world spaces kind of fall out.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've been mentioning that, because one of the things that I've noticed in here is a lot of stuff that we're doing is very much, except for drying clothes.
I'd have to get up and turn it off, but yeah. I'll just sit here for now.
That's okay. Is very much a lot of what we're doing here is very much a brute force approach to the way we're envisioning virtual environments. There is no WordPress for 3D, right? There is no Ing for 3D. There's no eBay for 3D. Right, it's all those Web 2.0 constructs that really sort of came into their own after about 2001, 2002. We don't have any of them here. We don't have the tools to sort of make those particular things happen. It's still, to my way of looking at this, anyways, is still we're still mired in sort of like the early 1990s of where the web used to be. Right, where if you wanted a news group, you actually had to go out and write it yourself. You didn't just pick one off the shelf and say, okay, there you go, there's a news group. Right? And the simplicity, the elegance of how these environments are created and the ability to bring different components together, I think really needs to sort of be there from... I sort of hate to say the word the masses, but a lot of people that we deal with in here on a day-by-day basis are very creative in terms of how they do things. Most everybody here knows how to build. They know how to do some basic scripting. They know how to do some texturing. They know how to work with the tools, right? But they're not necessarily always, the other people, once you start getting more and more critical mass in here, right, and more people start to come in here that don't understand the technology side of it, right? I see that as sort of being really one of the critical things. How do we? Yeah, I'm afraid to say this word. How do we basically turn this almost into Windows for the Windows version of Second Life, where you don't have to understand an operating system? Do you see a lot of that sort of being some of the tactical drivers for those particular types of tools that are essentially going to make the content creation easier?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry,
my follow-up to that was just or is that just going to be part of the process? That's just going to be, is that potentially just part of the way things are going to develop regardless?
Well, I can't remember who said it in the audience, but somebody in the audience said something I thought very important. Said, you need to use the tools that you have on hand instead of, if you wait forever for perfection, you'll never make anything. You need to use the tools that you have at your disposal now while you're thinking about and planning for, tools that you'll be able to use in the future. And I think really that's what it all comes down to. You have to work with what you have here while thinking about how to do things with tools that you don't have yet. And if there are tools that you need that no one else is making, maybe you should try to make them or find people to make them. In terms of interfaces, everybody talks about it's got to be easier. Virtual worlds have to be easier for people to access. And yes, that's kind of that's something you should have. Everyone should have been thinking about since the beginning. That's just kind of kind of a no-brainer to me. But the best interface is no interface. Okay, the thing that really made the telephone take off was when you didn't have to deal with operators, when you could just kind of pick up and then speed dial, and then like with the iPhone or just any cell phone, you could just pick it up and say somebody's name and you're connected. There's no interface there. You're just it's like the end game on Star Trek. You just tap your chest and it's like I want to speak to so and so, and suddenly you're just talking to them. There's no interface. So the best interface is no interface. And if you want to see where things are developing in terms of no interfaces to data, to virtual environments, then you really need to look to augmented reality research and development. What's currently happening in that space is the ability to overlay virtual information with physical visual information, and things like gesture sensors, things like the ability to have systems that respond intelligently to you based on things that you do instinctively. When I'm looking at an avatar in a virtual world, I really don't want to have to move my mouse over their face so that my avatar's eyes line up with them so they see me looking at them. I really just want my avatar to mimic that. If I am, the whole idea of augmented reality interfaces, giving you contextually relevant information is really the way to go. I think there's a it's Connect LOM Runner. Basically, it's a gestural interface that uses a camera that observes how you're moving. So there's nothing you have to wear. The future of all this will not be gloves you wear and virtual reality headsets. That's not what it's going to be about. What it's going to be about are computers. Technology that can sense what your body is doing and then allow the system to use those cues to allow you to navigate and control the technology. It was called Project Natal, but then they renamed it Connect with a K.
I think that's supposed to be coming out this November or something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Andrew Hughes was talking about that.
Yeah. Really, for me, there's a novel I always talk about. It's type it in here. Werner Vinge. Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge. That's really a wonderful piece of science fiction that I think Werner Vinge, is a hard science fiction writer, which means he takes current technological trends and extrapolates on them, and then mixes in, his own completely unique ideas, obviously. But one of the key things in that environment is, in that story, in the future, everybody wears contact lenses. And these contact lenses are actually what provide you with the augmented reality interface to the world around you. Which means if you're sitting at your desk and you need to see a computer screen, you just see one, visualized through your contact lenses. And you can't tell the difference between it and a physical screen. You just see it. And so that kind of augmented reality interface. So imagine, and in the story, it's really wonderful. There's a scene where they're in a cafe, and they're looking around, and half the people in the cafe aren't really there. They're avatars, but everybody sees them as if they're real, because everything is, of course, networked. In fact, even the term networked in an environment like that, if you think about it, the term networked it's like talking about an environment being oxygenated in the physical world. It doesn't make any sense. It's, in the future, everything will talk to everything, of course, just like there's oxygen everywhere. So you have these networked environments coupled with augmented reality, and you have the ability to really take things to the next level. And you could have environments where maybe everything you see is virtual, or environments where nothing is virtual and everything in between. I mean, in my opinion, that's really where this whole augmented reality thing is going. It's going to give us a spectrum of being able to create completely perceptually immersive virtual experiences, as well as allow us to continue to see the physical world and all of its awesomeness and naturalness, and then everything in between, a mix of virtual and physical.
Very good. Well, Pathfinder, it's been great having you here. We've sort of come up to the end of our hour, and hopefully we'll get a good opportunity to have you back a couple more times before the end of the year.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thank you very much.